Hello again, this is Daniel, and I'm going to be teaching Week 2's first lecture. We're going to talk about aesthetic relationships and hierarchy within a design composition, and in addition to that, we're going to talk about the design methodology, or our creative process of making a design. So, I'm going to use a poster that's promoting Ridley Scott's movie Prometheus to talk about aesthetic relationships and hierarchy. But before we dive into that, I'd like you to watch a 3-minute trailer for the movie Prometheus. It's going to be really valuable because it's going to give you, a deeper perspective into the conceptual, like the psychologically conceptual elements of this movie. And you'll be able to see that in the poster. So go ahead, pause this lecture right now, and in the lecture you're going to see a link to the trailer for Prometheus. So go ahead, watch the 3-minute trailer, and then once it's done, come back and we'll continue the lecture. Alright? See you in 3 minutes. Okay, that was a good segue into discussing aesthetic relationships and hierarchy. So, in this slide, you can see in Figure 1, that's the actual poster itself promoting the movie Prometheus. And what we're going to talk about is, the first thing we're going to talk about is aesthetic relationships. And there's 2 types of aesthetic relationships. So, if you look at the piece as a whole, so Figure 1, if you look at the whole poster itself, you want macro aesthetics are tied to the whole. So, if you think about it, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. So this poster it's more than simply, a statue, that looks ominous in the background, plus, the smoky fog, plus the explorer, and then the tagline, and then the title Prometheus. It's more than all that. They all kind of combine to create, the macro aesthetics. Now the micro aesthetics, that's exactly the opposite. So that pertains to the details. So, if you look at, Figure 2, the micro aesthetics of the statue. That's, things like the texture of how it's made. You can see it's got a geometric pattern on it. You can tell it's some sort of either metallic or stone, material. And if you look at Figure 3, the micro aesthetics of Figure 3 would be, the sans serif typeface, the smoky background, and Figure 4, that's also micro aesthetics. So that's macro and micro aesthetics. So macro aesthetics, they have to do with the whole piece, and micro aesthetics have to do with the different elements within the design. So when you're thinking about micro and macro aesthetics and elements, you want to think about typographic elements, visual elements, and conceptual elements. So, for example, a macro aesthetic with typographical elements would be, if you look at Figure 1 at the bottom, the credits there, macro typography would say that the credits form a sort of platform that the explorer can stand on. So if you think about not the individual letters themselves, but the shape that they create, it's this long platform-like rectangle, that would be a macro aesthetic. Now a macro visual aesthetic would be, basically think about the overall color palette of this. So it's almost monochromatic. It's this sort of eerie bluish greenish gray color. That's predominant throughout the whole piece. So that's a macro visual aesthetic. Additionally, think about the contrast throughout the whole piece. So it's got a dark contrast to it, throughout the whole piece. So that would be a macro visual aesthetic. And moving on to the macro conceptual aesthetics, that's the general emotions, psychological emotions that it makes you feel. So, it creates this mood of fear, and yet, excitement. It exudes the concept of exploration and, the mystery of the unknown. And, of course, the tagline, which kind of unifies the whole thing. If you look at figure 3, it's in the middle of the poster there. Yeah. The search for our beginning could lead to our end. That, even though it's a micro visual element, it's a macro conceptual element, because it basically defines the message that this whole piece is really saying. So that's a little bit about macro aesthetics. Diving into the typographic, visual, and conceptual micro aesthetics of this. If you look at typographic micro aesthetics, you can look at figure 4. So that E, U, from the title Prometheus, if you notice, it has, it has an expanded tracking. So there's a significant gap between the letters. And if you look at figure 1, at the whole title, Prometheus, there's significant tracking throughout the whole thing. And what this does is it spreads the letters across, and it creates a feeling of open space, and that aligns to the overall, concept of exploration and the mystery of the unknown, because it creates this feeling of, being alone in this large expanse. Additionally, with micro typographic aesthetics, if you look at figure 4, if you notice I talked about how the credits create a platform, that's macro, but micro, the way this visual element achieves that is this condensed typeface. If you look at the letters in the credits, they're squished together, they're really tall, and they're really thin. And what that does is it makes it, when you move away from it and you look at it, it makes it much easier for you not to notice the individual letters, but to just see the shape that they make. The credits themselves aren't supposed to be the main focus of this poster. So it makes sense that, as a micro aesthetic, they would not give them, a typeface that's not condensed, for example. That would be more legible, because really what they want you to see is the message, the search for our beginning could lead to our end. Visual microaesthetics include, I mentioned the texture on the statue. If you look at figure 2, you can definitely see it looks like it's some sort of metal. It definitely looks aged and weathered. So that would be a visual microaesthetic. If you note on figure 5 how the explorer, it basically has this silhouetted form, that would be a visual microaesthetic, because it's only pertaining to a particular visual element. So again, the statue is a visual element, the explorer is a visual element, the title Prometheus is a visual element, and the tagline, the search for a beginning could lead to our end, is a visual element. So the characteristics of these particular elements, that's the micro, that's the pieces. And then the characteristics that, all these parts combine to create an effect that's greater than just the sum of the parts, that's the macro aesthetic. Thinking conceptually, we talked about the macro conceptual elements of fear, excitement, the mystery of the unknown. If you look at figure 2, a micro conceptual aesthetic would be, how it looks like an ominous being, this statue. It looks like it's, staring down in a menacing way. And that sort of psychological factor is pertaining to this particular element. So that's a micro conceptual aesthetic. If you look at figure 5, you know, the concept of individual curiosity, just within that explorer, you know, that would be a micro conceptual aesthetic. So you have these micro and macro aesthetics, and they're used to create a mood and a feeling. But the way these graphic elements are put on the design and the layout of this poster, that's when we get to start talking about hierarchy. So, again, hierarchy is, okay, moving on from aesthetic relationships, hierarchy is all about leading the eye to where you want it to go and view the design. So, if you just glance at figure 1, think about what did you first see? That's what they wanted you to first see. Personally, when I look at it, because I'm more of a visual than a verbal thinker, I actually don't see the title Prometheus. The first thing I see when I look at it is this ominous statue staring down at me. So that has a strong, you know, presence. So they gave that strong hierarchy. And since it's looking down, that leads me, actually it makes me go past the tagline, then I look at the explorer, and then that makes me look up and you see the tagline. The search for a beginning could lead to our end. So those three elements there have a relationship of hierarchy. So the statue and the explorer are both looking up and down at each other, and stuck in the middle between them you have the tagline. So that creates a downward and then an upward movement in the design, because they lead your eye to look down and then up across the elements. Of course, then, it's hard to not see the title Prometheus. That has a strong visual hierarchy, and that's achieved because it's all capital letters, it's large, and it has this sort of a gradient on it. It's brighter in the middle than it is on the sides, and that kind of matches the microaesthetic that the light creates. So basically, as far as hierarchy goes, the statue and the figure, they are used to make the tagline prominent. But then the tagline isn't huge, it's a small tagline, because the mood that they want to create is this mood of exploration and this mood of, you know, the human being is such a small, you know, such a small thing in comparison to, you know, what we're trying to find out, these big questions that we're trying to answer. So that's a little bit about aesthetic relationships and hierarchy. Okay, so we talked a little bit about aesthetic relationships and hierarchy. Moving on from that, let's talk about the design methodology. So that's the way we design something. It's our creative process. So typically for Christian and I, we have a 4-stage methodology. It consists of definition, validation, transformation, and convergence. So if you look at this slide, you'll see, you know, definition, you know, it talks about defining what the problem is that you're trying to solve with design. You know, defining the roots of the problem, you know, defining who you're trying to communicate to. Stage 2, validation, you know, that kind of delves into more research, you know, researching the target audience, and kind of using the perspective that this additional research will give you to enhance the design problem. So you get to redefine what the problem is after you've studied, you know, and done more research. And then, of course, transformation. That's where you actually design a prototype, you test it on, different members of the target, and you get to reevaluate how effective it is based on the tests. And then convergence, that's where you roll out, the full scale, design, and you get to measure the effectiveness of it, and then you get to recommend improvements. So that's, looking at the high level view of our design methodology. Let's delve into the granular, aspects of it, just to give you a little more of a, detail about this. So stage 1, definition. It's got 3 steps to it. There's define the problem, define the causes, and define the target audience. So when you define the problem, you want to ask yourself questions like, why is design necessary for this? How significant is the problem? What is the problem? And can visual communication really contribute to a solution? So with the example of Prometheus, Ridley Scott wanted to spread awareness of his new movie. One of the problems that he had to overcome was basically Prometheus is connected to the Alien saga, and the last few Alien movies really kind of were terrible. So he needed to convince his target audience that Prometheus wasn't going to be a flop, that Prometheus was this grand new serious movie that really finally showed his vision of what the future would look like. So as far as how significant the problem was, for James Cameron, it was very significant. He was a very passionate, creator of movies, and this is his baby. He wants it to be a success. So that's define the problem. Defining the causes, we kind of mentioned that the last few Alien movies were pretty terrible. So that's the cause of the problem. And defining the target audience, you would ask questions like, who would want to see a sci-fi movie? It's going to be existing Alien fans, it's going to be people who are sci-fi enthusiasts in general, and also people who might want to just see something that's a little different than what they've seen in the past. So that's stage 1, definition. So in stage 2, validation, that's where you delve into quantitative and qualitative research. You visually research your target audience, you enhance the design problem, and you determine and validate channels of communication. So in quantitative research, that's where you do things like look at competitors' posters. You do a content analysis. That's a content analysis is kind of like what we talked about with the previous slide. You want to look for micro and macro aesthetics in competitor posters. You want to look at their use of visual imagery, their use of micro aesthetics and macro aesthetics, and what you want to do is see how they're solving the design problem, and then you of course want to create a superior solution, because in most cases a poster for Prometheus is not the only poster that's going to be in a movie theater. So moving on to qualitative research, that's where you aim to understand how the poster would work in a real environment. So you think about a movie theater, that's where you see a lot of posters for upcoming movies. People walk around, what's on their mind? Are they really interested in the posters, or are they just passively interested because they're really thinking about, okay, can I get my tickets? How big is the line? Do I want to get popcorn that costs too much money? What are people really thinking about in a real environment? So that's qualitative research. When you visually research the target audience, you want to speak the language of the target audience. So what types of visual forms of communications do people really resonate with? Looking at the trailer for the movie, Hopefully it got an emotional response from you, and if it did, then the trailer was done effectively. It spoke, it spoke to the language that you understand as a movie enthusiast. Moving on to enhancing the design problem, that's where, after all this research you've done in the validation stage, you can kind of go back to define the problem, and with your new, broader perspective, refine what the problem really is. So the idea is, the perspective that you've gotten from stage 2 can help you create a more comprehensive design problem and essentially a better solution. The next part of validation, the last part, is determine and validate channels. That's where you decide, is the poster the best communication material? Do we really need to have a poster, or is the trailer alone going to work in a marketing campaign? Where do we want to put the poster? When and where do we want to show the movie trailer? What other types of communication channels? TV, radio, movie, commercials, posters, magazine, ads. What other types of communication channels would we like to use? So that's the end of stage 2. Moving on to stage 3, in transformation, you design a prototype. So typically, designers are going to make, 2 or 3, potential designs, and then they're going to test them. So that's test on members of the target audience, and they're going to, have people will usually take surveys and say, how did this poster impact you? Did it make you want to see the movie? How much on a scale of 1 to 10? And then they'll ask lots of other questions on the survey, and they'll get their results, and then they'll move on to the last part of transformation. That's reevaluate. So the results that the test members give them will help them decide whether or not it was a good design. Like, oh, okay, they actually didn't like this, and this is what they didn't like about it. Okay, let's go back to the prototype and let's fix it. And then once they do that, then they'll move on to stage 4, which is convergence, and they will have hopefully a refined design that they'll roll out into full scale, and again, they'll test it, and they'll measure the effectiveness of it. And again, they'll recommend even more improvements. So that's the last stage. But I know in this chart I have it set up linearly, so it's like 1, then 2, then 3, then 4. But in the real world of design, you will jump from one stage back to another depending on what you find out. But ultimately, you want to move to convergence and create a complete design. So that's a little bit about our design methodology, and that pretty much concludes today's lecture. So we talked about aesthetic relationships, hierarchy, and the design methodology. Thanks for listening, and tune in next time.